Good morning. My name is Barry Hirsch, and I'm a clinical associate professor at the NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate School of Continuing and Professional Studies, and I'm delighted to be here and to see so many of you here this morning. We're going to use a slightly different format for this panel. Partly, we're going to take some of our cues from Ed Glazer. And there were two things I really liked about Mr. Glazer's talk. One was that he left time for questions, which we will do also. And the second is that he put things in a historic context and talked about how we got here and what that tells us about going forward towards a smart city and talk about smart innovation. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers and in order in which they're going to speak, and then we will take questions after that. Part of what got my mind working listening to Mr. Glazer was think a little bit about the historic context of what we're doing. Commissioner Benefi, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on bios, they're in your handouts, but Commissioner Benefi leads an agency that can trace its roots for 325 years, that has names like Olmsted and Vaugh and Robert Moses, more recently Hoving, Heckscher, and Henry Stern. What makes me such a fan of not just the New York City Parks, but the New York City Parks Department is their history of innovation, the Natural Resources Group, and the way they have looked at green and open space, first as recreation facilities and open space, but also as a green infrastructure. And their work in all kinds of sustainability, including, just as one example, dealing with storm drainage systems, which has now become a greater issue as we try to have less engineered solutions and more natural solutions. In contrast, we have Dr. Daniel Walsh. Those of you who know me are not at all surprised that I managed to get the city's brownfields expert on this panel. Dr. Walsh leads an agency that can trace its roots to 2007 and Plan NYC, and that was formally created 22 months ago. Dr. Walsh has an extraordinary technical background, a real expertise in everything dealing with contamination. But equally important, he has been a great innovator in the way of dealing with and accelerating our processes for reusing sites. And if you take Professor Glazer's themes about how we use land, and you look at New York City, that in order to grow, we want to use land that had previously been industrial and is probably contaminated. And he has led a series of innovations to reuse, in typical modest New York style, all of our brownfield sites. From the private sector, we also have, in a way, a similar dichotomy. Rebecca Kraft is Director of Energy Efficiency at Consolidated Edison, which goes back to 1830 as a gas company, and 1870s with Thomas Edison, helped make it an electric company. And while we still rely on Con Ed, so that when we flick the switch, the light goes on or the gas goes on, really taking it to a new level in terms of smart use of our resources, about a system that's citywide. And that will help us be a smart city going into the future. And finally, we have Wasim Sheikh, who's a Senior Director of Internet Business Solutions at Cisco Systems. Cisco is a company that goes back to 1984. In the technology space, you really have to count in dog years, so that's pretty old for a technology company. But still a relatively young company. And what he works with are the systems that are not only inside our buildings, which you heard about in the last panel, which having individual smart buildings, but having networks, having groups of buildings, groups that are defined by geography, portfolios that are defined by ownership, and different ways of making not just smart buildings, but a smart set of buildings and a smart city. And by the way, for a real estate conference, we haven't talked a lot about money. Both of our private sector speakers have a lot of background in finance. So you can think about that for your questions. So with that, Commissioner Benepe.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. It's a great pleasure to be here again at NYU. I spent a lot of time here. I was never lucky enough to be a student here, but I feel like I am when I come back here, particularly when I go to Washington Square Park and see all the students cutting class there. This is a great honor to be at this panel because it's such a smart and informed audience. And I think I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining to you why sustainability is an important concept as we go forward into the future of New York. There are 8.4 million of us here in New York City, and we're expected to grow by another million by the year 2030. And so the city is getting bigger, and our infrastructure will be getting older, and our environment is getting more and more unpredictable. For example, we just had the snowiest January in the history of the city. Last summer, we had the hottest summer in the history of the city, and then last September, you may recall, particularly those of you who live in Brooklyn or Queens, 2 tornadoes ripping through and carving that path of destruction and taking down about 4,000 trees within the space of 15 minutes. Why is that important? Because we take care of the trees in addition to all of the other green infrastructure. And there are 29,000 acres and growing of city parkland in New York City alone. And those of you who own or maintain property understand that's a lot of parkland. You add the 22,000 acres of federal parkland and 700 acres of state parkland. That's over 52,000 acres just of parkland, not including things like cemeteries and other open green space. That's 25% of New York City. So when we talk about how to build a smarter, more sustainable city, we have to think about that 25% of land that is parks. Now, we in the Parks Department oversee or maintain about 5,000 separate pieces of property. That includes 1,800 neighborhood parks and playgrounds, as well as the areas adjacent to highways, and 10,000 acres of natural areas, wetlands and woodlands and meadows and forests. Now, just a couple of quick slides, because we're going to go through this really quickly. Everybody knows that New Yorkers don't have backyards for the most part, unless you're lucky enough to have one. 2/3 of us rent, and more than 83% of New Yorkers live in a housing unit, in some kind of a housing complex of more than one unit. So parks become these really incredible sanctuaries for the stress of city life. Parks play important ecological functions too. Trees, as you know, absorb carbon dioxide. They trade that for oxygen, and they provide shade. They lower the ambient temperatures, and they slow climate change. All the tree planting beds and plant beds absorb stormwater runoff, helping to alleviate flooding. That's why Mayor Bloomberg is leading this great charge to add 1 million trees to New York City. And just as Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvin Vaux, who are the co-designers of Central Park and Prospect Park and Morningside Park, intended, parks are a forum for diversity and for public expression, so a different kind of sort of social sustainability. And if you walk through Washington Square on any kind of a nice day, you'll see people of all ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds and ages and walk of life coming together. So together, the Parks Department with our architects and landscape architects and planners, natural resources managers, we are working very hard to see, okay, what is the paradigm for the parks of the 21st century? We know about the 19th century parks of Olmsted and Vaux. We know about Moses in the 1930s. So here are some highlights. Last month, in partnership with the Design Trust for Public Space, we published the first how-to manual for sustainable parks and landscapes. This is called High Performance Landscape Guidelines, 21st Century Parks for New York City. But it's not just for New York City. This is a way to say parks are not just beautiful places, but they have to be healthy ecosystems. And so you can build or retrofit green roofs. You can implement stormwater capture systems. You can implement sustainable practices in design and maintenance to get us to a higher level of use. And the hope is that this will become a manual for landscape architects, for construction managers, for maintenance operations staff, not just in New York City parks, but in parks and people who manage land across the city. those of you who have complexes that include land, you can use this book to figure out how to manage it in a more sustainable way. And just around the corner here in LaGuardia Place at the Center for Architecture, there's an exhibition about sustainable guidelines. Now, one example of 21st century parks, I hope all of you have seen. If you haven't, you should get there as soon as the weather warms up, or even while it's still winter, is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I will tell you is the ultimate recycled park, the ultimate sustainable park. It's designed by Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, a landscape architecture firm based in Brooklyn Heights in downtown Brooklyn. And through a really advanced concept of adapted reuse, we are turning this chain of abandoned mid-20th century piers and warehouses into an 80-acre waterfront park that stretches from Atlantic Avenue in the south. And what you see there is this a rendering showing how ultimately be developed. So all the way at the top of the picture, you see Atlantic Avenue and Pier 6, all the way to the bottom at the north under the Manhattan Bridge in Dumbo. Much of that has already been transformed, and big sections of the park are already open. Now, how is this a recycled park? First of all, it was all flat. We've created a series of hills, and the hills use ground-up stone from the digging of the East Side Access Tunnel to build the hills and to be porous so water can go down through it. Those beautiful granite stairs you see there are recycled from the old Willis Avenue Bridge when we reconstructed that to make steps and stone walls along the river. For the benches and for the cladding of buildings, an old cold storage building which was on the site has been taken down and demolished, and the wood is being recycled. And then old piers are being preserved as ecological habitat. And the entire site is being watered using captured stormwater. There's a very complex underwater water storage system, so the rainwater percolates down through that stone into these underground reservoirs. On a much smaller and local scale, those of us who grew up in New York City remember the neighborhood playground. Well, the neighborhood playground, is built in the 1930s and 40s, is not a very environmentally friendly space. It's designed to be easily maintained, a lot of asphalt and concrete and metal and steel. But this is a playground in the Bronx, Pearly Gates Playground. It was recently rebuilt, but we made it a sustainable playground. We installed a rain garden to capture stormwater runoff from the park's asphalt surfaces. These rain gardens reabsorb stormwater into planting beds instead of allowing it to go straight into the sewage system and then becoming part of the combined sewer overflow and dumping all that polluted water into the river. And one of the big hallmarks of everything we're doing in the city now is trying to capture and slow down that stormwater runoff. In the old days, we tried to figure out how quickly can we get it off the site into the sewers, but that creates these combined sewer overflows. In addition to capturing the stormwater, we used local stone instead of importing it from China for the gate posts. We used recycled asphalts. We used 90% recycled material in the rubber safety surfacing. Recycled glass is used for the underpavement. And all of the bench slats, instead of being made of tropical hardwood, are made from recycled plastic. And even in the water feature, it's reduced low-flow spray showers, which saves the equivalent of 7 Olympic-sized pools worth of water every summer. And then reducing the pavement, replacing with planting beds, we increased the permeable surface by 5-fold. In addition, we are busy building green buildings. Across the street from Yankee Stadium, the new Mill Pond Park just got a LEED certification for its reuse of an old cold storage building which has a green roof. And then in Brooklyn, down by Marine Park, our architects have designed a LEED silver building, which has a rooftop solar farm, which will produce 10% of the building's electrical needs, a green roof to insulate the building and reduce stormwater runoff, a geothermal system. We're going down into the ground to get that water that will provide both cooling and heating. Overall, this building, and something for us all to think about, by using green building techniques, we have a 45% less energy use to a comparable building of the same size. And I think if we all do that with even sort of humble structures like park houses, we can try to meet the mayor's goal, which is to reduce the carbon output of the city by 30% over the next 15 or so years. So it's a big challenge for all of us, and I look forward to taking some more questions. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking NYU and Barry Hirsch for inviting me to be here today. It occurs to me that some of you may not know what a brownfield is, so let me start by defining the term. A brownfield is a vacant or underutilized piece of land that stays vacant or underutilized because of environmental contamination. These sites are inherently non-competitive, and the problem is that over time, they're repeatedly passed over, and they tend to accumulate, and they become an economic development drain to our cities. There are two main reasons why developers choose not to take on these sites in most cases. First is liability risk, the fear of being sued. And the second is regulatory risk, the fear of governmental enforcement, and if governmental programs are required for management of a site, the uncertainty in the time and the cost for navigating those programs. Now, cities have a vested interest in brownfield revitalization. There's no question about that. Cities deal with land use, cities deal with zoning, and it's remarkable to think that up until very recently, cities have had virtually no role in brownfield cleanup anywhere in this country. But this is critical because cities are dependent on states and state programs that perform the function of regulatory oversight of cleanup. Now, if you think about a state like New York, we have 60 or 70 cities that have to work within several state programs. There's just not enough resource capacity at the state level to provide the tools and the resources to a city like New York to enable these properties to get revitalized in an efficient way. So enter Plan YC. Mayor Bloomberg's sustainability plan in 2007, and I think a remarkable show of foresight. An entire chapter of that plan is dedicated to this issue. Over the last 2 years, an office was created for brownfield management in the mayor's office in 2008, and since that time, we've been working very hard to develop a whole series of tools and resources to address this problem. And earlier it was discussed that governmental regulations have a tendency to get in the way. As you'll see, these programs are all voluntary. They're designed to solve problems and to enable properties to move forward and unlock their potential. Let me talk about the first. And by the way, all these programs are brand new. They've all been launched within the last 6 months or so. And we're now looking to the next generation of Plan YC to go deeper into the problem solving. First program I'd like to discuss is, let me find my slide here. The New York City Brownfield Cleanup Program. This is the first municipally run cleanup program in the country. It is designed to address regulatory risk. And by design, it's intended to be streamlined and fast, predictable, and attentive to developers' needs, while at the same time accomplishing high-quality cleanups. That's done through a variety of ways, but basically we only handle light to moderately contaminated sites that are more easily managed and cleaned up. And we can do that through creation, I won't get too detailed here, but creation of what's called presumptive remedies. These are remedies that are pre-designed for common environmental conditions that are typically in the light to moderate range. We also use this program to manage liability risk. Under a law passed in 2009, by navigating and completing this program, you get a complete New York City liability release. And through an agreement with the state, you also get a New York State liability protection. So just to make it clear, we're working very closely with the state of New York. They're fully on board. These programs are now operating and functioning. We're also developing a staff that understands and recognizes the timelines in the development process, and we're really trying to create an elite unit of problem solvers. The second program is called the Brownfield Incentive Grant Program, or the BIG program. This program provides city investment. Right now the fund is at $9 million, and the goal is to invest in investigation and cleanup of brownfield sites. We typically provide somewhere between $60,000 and $140,000 per project, and we pay for things like zoning analyses, title searches, Phase 1, Phase 2 investigations, cleanup, and environmental insurance. We administer this program, but frankly, I have little interest in how that money's used, as long as it's used to advance these projects and increase the transactions, cleaning up sites and redeveloping them. It's flexible. It gets money into the street in a short period of time, on average, in about 6 weeks. The third program is something called the New York City Green Property Certification Program. I'm not going to go in great detail, but just think of the equivalent of LEED for the property itself. This is a New York City certification that a site is protected of public health and the environment for its intended use. And you get this as a matter of right by navigating and completing the cleanup program. We've also created something called SPEED, a real estate search engine that is chock-filled with government environmental database information. And we've also done the equivalent of a Phase 1 or a paper environmental search of about 3,150 vacant properties throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. If you haven't seen this and you're interested in real estate, this is definitely a resource to check out. The website is listed on the slide. And just look for the SPEED icon. And then finally, just to conclude, we are really working to identify and solve the problems in this area. We've created a whole suite of new programs. This is going to be our basic infrastructure. But we're working with everyone throughout the industry, every sector. We're working with lenders, banks, equity lenders, REITs. We're working with real estate developers and brokers and on, trying to identify the problems that they encounter and come up with reasonable and intelligent solutions that we can bring to the marketplace. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm going to get a slide up here. Oh. Okay. Boy, it's nice to be up here and see so many people. It's early in the morning. We started early in the morning, as somebody said earlier, and it's great that so many people are interested in what is both a very important topic and also, I think, a far more complicated topic than most people are willing to acknowledge and deal with. The smart city has a lot of levels. We heard earlier about the end use piece of that, which are smart buildings. We'll hear more about that, I think, this afternoon, a little later. I wanted to focus a little bit on the infrastructure piece, in addition to sort of the city infrastructure. We view a smart city and a smart grid and smart buildings a little differently than the real estate community does, probably, and a little differently than you do as occupants of those buildings. But we certainly agree that the challenge is immense. I think Chris Pike said that earlier. To give you a feel, when we look out at the city, we see 3 million electric customers, 1 million gas customers, 10 million people to serve. We have 130-odd thousand miles of cable in the ground, lots of gas mains, about 4,500 miles of that. But we also see about 600 million feet of office space. That's square feet of office space. That's a pretty big number. About between 400,000 and 500,000 businesses, between 900,000 residential units, 900,000 and 1 million residential units. That's a huge challenge to try to move that curve in order to reduce carbon over the long run, but also improve the infrastructure over the long run. So my first point is the smart grid and smart buildings are really not just about meters. I think Dr. Lee said earlier, there are really a number of components, instrumentation, interconnectedness, and intelligence that comes from that, those are all critical. And when we look at smart grid programs, we certainly see that the biggest bang for the buck in terms of reliability, in terms of risk reduction for the delivery of electricity, it's at the transmission and distribution levels, not at the building level. But at the building level and at the demand level, which is key to the smart grid, infrastructure is really only half the equation. The other half, and the part we don't talk about a lot, is really pricing. For those of you who are residential customers, you see a bill that tells you relatively little, and you might be able to glean from that the patterns of use month over month, 13 months kind of rolling.
Give this to Constantine.
For those of you who are larger customers, you have what's called a demand meter, and that at least gives you some form of dynamic pricing, and we can sort of ignore what the definition of dynamic is for the time being. It creates lots of great arguments. But at least you see a change in your price depending on the nature of the market. And in New York, we do have a market for electricity and for capacity, a little different. And it's really when we get to the point that the market reflects current demand, that people can make choices about that demand, and that will probably drive better decisions up and down the line about buildings. As Mr. Fox said earlier, the savings were immense by using the excess capacity from the cogen system to create ice. Ice allows a large building to cut the peak demand charges, and that's where large building owners pay a lot of money. We build to the peak. It's the point in time where you use the most electricity. We build to that peak regardless of whether we hit it. And one of the things that the smart grid can hopefully do is let us build less. So this just gives you a feel from the grid perspective of where the biggest bang for the buck is. Substations, that kind of piece traditionally between transmission and distribution. You can invest a lot, you'll get a little improvement in reliability. And these are statistics from the Electric Power Research Institute, so they're nationwide, which is a little skewed to what we see in New York. At the primary system, which is above what you see, a little investment goes a long way in terms of improving reliability. And those kinds of investments are automation of distribution, making the grid what we call self-healing and responsive. So we need less human intervention. So when there is a flaw, we can find it quickly. But more importantly, you want to know what's going on before there is a problem. And that is the key to some of the work we're doing in Smart Grid, the idea of detecting incipient faults. And then at the secondary level, you have things like advanced metering, meter data management systems, communication systems. And that's the point where we get to smart buildings. And it's at that point that we think the smart grid becomes very important in incorporating the supply side, the demand side into supply. We at Con Ed have lots of efficiency programs. A couple $100 million a year. We'd love to hand out more of it. We have what's called demand response programs, where we ask our customers to reduce their use on very hot days. But one of the things we do with those programs is we actually forecast what we think will be the use of those programs into our long-term demand forecast. And that is a forecast that drives our capital planning over the long term. So as buildings get smarter and can control more the use of the occupants' use of electricity, and we see that use being going up and down persistently, on hot days down, hopefully, we can incorporate that delta, as it were, into planning. And that means we see less growth of demand, and we can build less. And that, for us, is where the benefits come in for you. If we build less, lower rate base, less capital, but also we think we can get a grid that is more responsive when we need it to be, and that is also a way to increase reliability over time. So there are a bunch of smart grid programs in New York, just to give you a feel. We have a little demonstration compared to some of the grants you probably read about from the federal government in Long Island City that incorporated sort of all aspects of smart grid, from equipment on a primary system to electric vehicles. we got a large smart grid investment grant that we're using to deploy sensors and all kinds of equipment throughout our grid to make it far more both responsive and give us more information. We got a demonstration grant that we're using to try to build a command and control system that would facilitate the integration of renewables, electric vehicles, and building management systems into the grid. And there are some owners who will speak here this afternoon who we hope are going to be part of that. And then at the bulk transmission level, you should know that the New York Independent System Operator also received an investment for the grid to try to install equipment that would help prevent something like the blackout we had in 2003, which moved from west to east and cascaded across the country. And so with that, thank you very much.
I don't see yours. I asked her. We have a small technical pause. While we're waiting, I'm going to ask our panelists to start thinking about my first question, which will get the question started, which is, what are you doing within your own organizations, each of you? How are you getting your staff and your own managers get ready for the new era? So we're going to start with that question, and hopefully your slide, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not really checked out on this system, so slight pause. But again, good morning. Great to be here. Great to be back in New York. And I am going to talk about smart as well as, let's say, connected cities. Now, why? Because I was asked to do that. But I would let's postulate that smart is really in the eye of the beholder. So it's more about, let's say, connectivity more than it is about smart that I'll talk about. Now, since I'm from a technology company, I'm sure some of you are expecting that I will talk about technology, so let me get that out of the way quickly. First, about technology, one of the real, let's say, truisms one finds is in fact that, let's say, technology is enabling levels of performance. And in this case, I'm specifically referring to business performance, which were not previously achievable or available. That's one thing. So what this means is that for a business, there has to be a cost-benefit ratio which is favorable to them. Thanks. Thank you. Second point about technology, that see, if you think about a building or indeed a city or even a country, now Singapore is a city and a country, and I've had some experiences there. So there are actually three key components to habitability. There's land, obviously, for a building, for a city, for a country, water, and normally energy. And my second point is that internet is in fact the fourth leg of that table, so it's no longer a three-legged stool. And to the extent that that is true, I will make some comments about that. And three, about technology, that to the extent that actually people adopt technology, most of the decision makers that one meets are at a certain age in their lives where, in fact, they're not really convinced about the uses of technology. So it's like the Arab-Israeli conflict where it's said that it would only get solved until the current generation goes away. So I'm very positive that over time, there will be a slow movement of adoption of technology, but I'm sure I'll be retired by then. So what I really want to talk about, other than technology, is what are the major trends that are really impacting the movement towards, I would say, connectedness, whether those are individuals, whether those are companies, the way they do business with each other, or indeed how we play a role in that universe, whether there is, whether we are a worker, whether we are a manager, or whether we are just a citizen, or in most cases, perhaps all three. So there is the part about let's say, about people generally getting older, especially in the developed world, but also when you start looking at China and the like, and you see India passing them, that is because of that very peculiar population dynamic. I'm sure the one-child rule plays a part in that as well. So that's the part about, let's say, growth, where in, of course, very many places, the adoption of technology becomes very rapid. I want to remind the audience that about 15 years ago, the most connected country in the world was actually Sri Lanka. And here was the reason. You see, they never had the resources to actually string copper wire all over their country. So when, of course, the wireless came along, that was really a godsend for them. So therefore, they adopted wireless a lot faster than, in fact, that was adopted here. So that's an example of where there are opportunities, especially in those, let's say, developing nations, and that's the reason why most of the companies in the world are actually gravitating towards serving those markets. And the last point, and that was made by actually a previous speaker as well, that it is about the urbanization. China this year, they will have 9.8% growth in their GDP, and 1 point of GDP equals approximately around 100 million people actually becoming urban. So they leave, which is the reason why China would not go back under 8% growth, mainly because that means that 100 million people have to go back. So this is the framework that we think of when we start thinking about where is it that where we see the next markets coming in terms of let's say connectedness. Now making it a little bit more, let's say, granular, in almost any building or I would say any city or any state or in any country, these are some of the major infrastructure investments which are made by either the government or in some cases, let's say, private as well as public sector companies together. But the one part that we see in especially the, let's say, developed world, that because of the aging population, because of the cost of business being higher than, of course, the less developed countries, that people power becomes more and more scarce. So to be able to use technology to perhaps combine some of these services and then be able to achieve the level of, let's say, business performance, which wasn't achievable. So here I want to give you two examples. One is that I'm sure for those of you who have been around for a while, you have actually worked in offices where you needed to have a phone moved. And you would normally call the phone company, and it would be a few weeks of delay, and then they would show up, and then they would physically move the phone, so you have to be out of your office for a while. Or perhaps they do it at night, that means you have to pay overtime. So now, with, of course, the, let's say, connectedness becoming so pervasive, that you can have an internet-based phone, so therefore, whenever you move offices, you just simply plug your phone in there, and it knows where you are. Now, here's the application. For those of you who manage, let's say, apartment buildings. Now, you have, of course, new tenants coming in, so you have to do the lock and key part, where you have to give them a new key or a lock. So just imagine if all of that was being taken care of. Imagine if, of course, as soon as they got in there, that in fact they would get the phone service right away. These are the things which are extremely cost effective, and they are really behind at a granular level in here. The other example I give you is a supermarket. Now, approximately 60% of the fixed cost of a supermarket goes in their heating and cooling. Now, so in not too distant of a past, if you wanted to put a probe by, let's say, the freezer, the average cost of just installing a probe happened to be $300. Now you can go and you can buy a wireless probe for $47, and you don't need a union person to come in and install a probe. You don't need an electrician, and it's live on arrival. That's again a part of how various communities are now connecting, which wasn't available before, and it really gives them lower costs, lower cycle times of course, doing business or achieving a result, and it gives people a competitive advantage, whether you're selling an apartment building for a rental, whether you are actually bringing in clients in a building, or whether you're indeed managing a whole city. Now, Cisco has been very active around the world, and while there are very few opportunities which happen to be greenfield, and they're in the middle, as you can imagine, Abu Dhabi, China, India are the examples. But then in the United States, San Francisco is the key city, mainly because Cisco is named after San Francisco, so therefore we have a natural affiliation. But there are a whole bunch of let's say, proofs of concepts. Now, the reason why I show this to you is in fact for let's say, two reasons. One of them is that it was mentioned earlier that there is not a lot of evidence how making investment into technology really pays back. Now, I know that each one of these examples, there are extremely robust models that actually predicted, in some cases, the overall payback within 9 months, and in some cases, those paybacks have been achieved even earlier. So whether you are working on a building, a city, a country, overall, you are really changing the world because you're making it more efficient by making it more connected, and over time, they will become smart as well. Thank you.
Took me 3 weeks to get my phone moved at NYU. As you can see, we've defined infrastructure broadly, and we've really picked on specific areas where there are kind of interesting things happening. So now I'll ask Rebecca Kraft, please, to answer my question about what you're doing to make the elephant dance, to look at the GE commercial, and use the microphone, and talk about what you're doing within GE to get ready for the smart city.
We're doing a number of things, and I guess we can look at it both internally. What are we doing to become a company that will function in a generation, in a world that will be very different? But also, what are we doing now to try to move the world in that direction, at least our little part of the world here in New York City? To address the second one first, because it's a little easier, we provide to our customers money for various types of efficiency and demand response programs. We think that's sort of what do we do with our customers to get us there. We'd certainly like to see more participation in those programs. We'd like to see more dynamic participations in those programs. The economy certainly isn't helping that at the moment. All those, becoming efficient, if you have an older building, is an expensive proposition. Internally, to get to be a different company in a different world, we're doing a number of things. One, we like all other big companies, have a management training program, And it's a pretty good one, having been at another company in financial services where there was a management training program. And I would say Con Ed's is unique in many ways. But the ability new hires to, and most of them are engineers, to spend at least some time in an energy efficiency department or in an environmental health and safety department where the focus is on not on something other than building traditional infrastructure for the future is certainly a big piece of that. I would say there are two other pieces. Secondly, my group, which has a whole bunch of different things in it, is in kind of the heart of electric operations, which is the largest piece of the company. And really when we look at networks and neighborhoods and see infrastructure needs, before we decide what to build, we always look to see if there is a way we can relieve the network from the demand side. That's a huge change. And even if you talk to the California utilities who have been doing efficiency for 30 years and who spend $1 billion or more every year, they will tell you that challenge in a large engineering company is a tough one, and it's one that takes generations to overcome. We think we're getting there. And then finally, we have a big sustainability program, and we hire to fill that program.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Well, thanks. I think it's really important when you want to have a sustainability as an ethos of your organization, whatever that organization is, to make it part of everyone's sort of personal business. So we actually have something called a Sustainability Taskforce, which was convened under one of our assistant commissioners. And we sort of got some of the mid-level young managers to each take an area of sustainability. That includes, first of all, metrics. What is sustainability? It's hard to define, so we have to have some ways to measure what we're doing the same way that the city is measuring through Plan YC everything that it's doing. So metrics was one of the task force committees. Then training and education. Everybody needs to be trained and educated about how to do things in a more sustainable way. Communicating sustainability. Leaf composting. A lot of leaves get generated when you have 5 million trees in New York City. And you can either take them to the landfill and have them take up valuable space, or you can compost them into topsoil. Public recycling, we can do a lot more recycling in parks. We've been expanding that dramatically. And then capital projects. All of our construction projects can be greener both in the construction and in the final product. The other thing we're challenging people to do is make some kind of a sustainability pledge. It can be very simple, like maybe even a hokey thing. Like my pledge is that I'm going to take the stairs always and not take the elevator. Luckily, I only go 3 flights. And then I'm going to pick up a few pieces of garbage every day. I do that anyway, but it's sort of like a leading by example. If everybody picks up 1 or 2 pieces of garbage, there's no garbage in the parks. It's that simple. So I think it's really important symbolically to walk the walk in addition to talking the talk, and everybody has to commit in some way to this concept of sustainability and do it in a practical way.
Okay, Dan, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Barry. I think great, thank you. From my perspective, the recycling of land is inherently one of the most sustainable things we can do. And I've been in this field in New York City for 2 decades, and my observations clearly indicate that the cleanup in the 21st century is really integrally linked to redevelopment of land. That the market forces of redevelopment really would get most of the cleanup done here in New York City and in most cities. So to integrate the cleanup process with the development process is absolutely critical. And within my organization, we work very hard to sensitize our employees, our managers, our project managers to the needs and the requirements of the development industry. And then more broadly, I mean, we're always working hard to think fresh and not rely on the way other people have done things historically. And the cleanup industry is incredibly new. It's only been around for about 2 decades. And I think most of the innovation has not happened yet. So we're really looking to establish the new ideas and the new innovations right here. I think we're doing a lot to empower the real estate industry and industry in general. And there's a lot of ways of doing that. Picking those sectors that don't have high capacity, and we're not talking about the big developers, but really the small and mid-sized developers, the local development corporations, economic development corporations, enabling them to realize their local visions with tools that we can bring to bear to help. And then aggregating the environmental industry itself, which has, historically been a spotty collection of about 100 different consulting firms, bringing them together, aggregating them, and then using the might of that collective force to create new resources like pro bono referral programs for developers that don't have high capacity. So I'd say generally, just really thinking in new ways and using imagination, I think, is probably the most valuable thing we can do.
Thank you. Now it's your turn. Would like to answer
Let
that
me,
also?
let me
Sorry.
give you, so I don't want to be an ad for Cisco. However, this is an area which is really important to our company. And I want to give you the problem statement to make the point that actually sustainability is actually a business imperative more than anything else. Just the San Jose campus alone, where there are the headquarters, the company spends $42 million a year in just electricity. And this is to keep not only the lights on in, of course, the buildings, but also the labs and the like. And so the goal is to actually reduce that in a very cost-efficient way. So we're using, for example, really leading-edge, I would say, technologies, things like smart dust, which are really particles that actually track equipment, where they actually shut off if that equipment hasn't been used, and the like. It's the same with the rooms. And so we have already reduced our electricity bill over the last 2 years by 18%, I believe. And I think that number is still going down.
Thank you all. Now it's your turn. Yes. Just wait for the mic. It's coming right there.
Yes, I have a question for Commissioner Benepe. About 2 years ago, there was a renovation of the FDR Drive. There was a great opportunity to create green space on the east side. There was hardly any space there, any green space on the east side. And the only thing that there is a small park by to the city, and I believe it's city land, but very private. Now, I know that there are an awful lot of people there, such as Secretary Kissinger living there. He put a squash on it, but why did we allow that to happen?
Okay, you're right, but you're wrong. So let me clarify. There are several challenges inherent with adding Parkland on the east side. The first challenge is that when they built the FDR Drive in the 1930s until 1940, unlike it on the west side, they didn't build a park outboard of it. They could have, because in those days, as Dan will know, there was no state DEC regulations preventing you from building in the river. It would have been a big challenge because of the speed of the current in the East River. But they could have done it, and they didn't. Nowadays, to build into the river is almost impossible. It would require having the state DEC effectively gut its own regulations for building things into the water, leaving aside the challenges. That said, however, we are still hopeful that if the city can work out a deal to build a new building for the United Nations on a very small asphalt lot owned by the city, that's a piece of parkland there, in exchange, the mitigation for using an asphalt lot would involve the building of about a half-mile-long waterfront park promenade from about 42nd Street all the way up to connect with some of the promenade further on. The other hope was to use some of the, remember when they rebuilt the FDR Drive, they had to build an outboard temporary roadway. They left in place some of the infrastructure underwater with the hope that one day we could build a small sort of outboard walkway or park of some kind. Whatever you do there is tens and tens of millions of dollars. Anytime you build in or near the water, the costs go up exponentially. So there's a strong desire to it. Henry Kissinger, there were no big shots who had any role in stopping things. What has prevented things from ever being built along the East River there has been the enormous cost and the environmental regulations that fight against it. But the city would like eventually, and we do have plans to expand the parkland alongside the east side, perhaps not as big or as grand as we have on the west side, simply because we don't have the space to do it or the environmental regulations would prevent it. But we want to do something more than what's there now, and we have committed very much to doing that. There's a brand-new park from the Battery Maritime Building all the way up to South Street Seaport. We've just finished spending $70 million rebuilding the entire East River Park. So there's a great deal going on. It's just much more challenging on the east side than it was on the west side.
Yeah, I wrote an article about the complexity of waterfront brownfield redevelopment. And as you look at New York City and Manhattan in particular, how we've created parks all around Manhattan, it's really kind of extraordinary the last 30 years. Next question. Yes, sir.
Just in addition to the efficiencies that you described and in keeping with the theme of the conference, could you just talk a little bit about Con Ed's forecast for increased incorporation of renewables in the overall approach to providing energy?
You know, we actually don't forecast the growth of renewables, although we have seen in our service territory in the past couple of years, I believe a quadrupling, I think this is right, of solar. You know, wind is just tough here, but we've certainly seen really, really strong growth in solar. We don't anticipate that will go down, although any changes in the federal and state subsidies will dampen it. You know, the numbers, in terms of, you know, how we look at growth and growth of the system, traditionally, since the early 70s, the growth of demand, so the growth of that peak, has only been negative in one period, and that was during the New York City's fiscal crisis, when the population of the city declined. Since then, we've always seen growth, you know, year in, year out, until this past, the Great Recession, where we actually saw flattening. You know, when you're looking at a number, 13,000 plus megawatts, you know, kilowatts of solar don't really show up on the forecast. We see it, we think we're better at working with our customers to integrate solar, and DG generally, although there are probably people in this audience who would take issue with that. We've been working with the city and NYSERDA and some others to try to improve the permitting and regulatory processes in New York. It's an effort called the 100 Days of Solar. We think that is making some good progress. It's sort of in a second phase. And so, you know, we see it growing. It's just the numbers are so small, it doesn't really move the needle.
I have a question, Dan, I think for you. Thank you. Although, Rebecca, I want to just say that if you really are trying to give a few $100 million away and you're having a hard time, Shaq would be happy to talk to you. But I do have a question for Daniel. The city spends roughly $1 billion a year carting garbage outside of New York to Ohio and Pennsylvania and shipping it to Florida and other places. And yet there are lots of technologies that I think you all studied in the 2030 report that looks at the possibility of burning that waste and making energy out of it. And I guess I'm curious about where that is on the list of priorities. And as an adjunct to that question, I think it comes back to something Adrian mentioned a short while ago. The regulatory environment for new power plants sometimes could take 10 years to get a new plant online, which means by the time it comes online, the technology is almost old. So what are you doing in terms of trying to change that regulatory environment, and are there plans to do more waste-to-energy power plants in New York City?
Dan, you get to be sanitation commissioner for the minute.
I think I'm grossly under prepared to answer that question, but I'll try and give you a little feedback. Plan YC in the original version had 10 chapters. Solid waste was not one of them. And I know that it's a critical issue at the time. I think the city was working on a separate solid waste management plan. I know that solid waste is an extremely high priority for everybody. It's a high priority for the city, and it will be a chapter in the draft that's now being developed. The city's done an exhaustive amount of outreach, beginning late last winter into spring, both inside the city, outside the city, with communities. And solid waste, and the solving some of these problems is a critical issue, as you know. The city has a long history of incineration and of recent attempts, relatively recent attempts to use mass burn technologies that did not succeed. Had a 10 or 15-year period of tumultuous movement toward permitting and eventually did not work. It's a very complicated, very important issue, and I can guarantee that the plan will try and shed more light on it. I personally, though, I am not engaged in those discussions. I wish I could tell you more.
And one thing we're considering now is the possibility of a biomass plant for one of our facilities. Biomass, for those of you who don't know, it is the burning or high-temperature combustion of wood chips and other organic matter. My alma mater, Middlebury College, has made a pledge to go carbon neutral by 2016, and part of the way they're doing this is by eliminating the use of number 6 heating oil and instead burning at a very high temperature wood chips, waste wood chips created by the wood industry. They burn about 20,000 wood chips a year, and they've reduced their need for heating oil by 1 million gallons a year. They've taken care of half of their offset there. And they're looking to do the rest by using biomethane, which is even more interesting. That's the conversion of cow manure to gas, and the gas would be used for the additional heating. So between the waste products of wood chips and cow manure, they may be able to entirely heat this campus in north central Vermont, which gets cold all winter long. So we're now starting to look at the fact that we produce 20,000 tons of wood chips each year. Unfortunately, a lot of that ends up in landfills. It doesn't get all reused the way we'd like it to. And if we could convert some of that to energy to heat some of our pools and provide energy for skating rinks, that would be a very effective use of recycling. And I think we as a society have to ask a lot of questions. Dan alluded to it. Environmentalists led the fight to stop the advanced incineration plants. So instead what we're doing is spending huge amounts of money to ship our garbage to someone else's state. Environmentally, that may not be the most responsible thing to do, and maybe we should take a look at it. With all the new technologies that they use in Sweden, where cities go completely off the grid by burning their own waste and converting it into energy, shouldn't we be thinking a little bit bigger here in New York City? And we lost that battle a few years ago, but with the new technologies, maybe the time has come to consider burning our waste to convert it into energy rather than shipping it at great expense to someone else's state.
Thank you. Last question before lunch, over there, yes.
Around distributed power generation, and what component of Con Ed is looking at distributed power systems as or incentivizing that entire industry, which could be renewables, biomass, the whole deal.
There's a lot of conversation around distributed generation. On the renewable side, the subsidies for renewables are really at the state level, and there's a charge on your bill. It's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard Charge, and so every ratepayer in New York pays that, and that money goes into a pot, and NYSERDA administers that and provides grants for renewables. Within the city, DG, certainly we and our large customers have had lots of engaging conversations about DG. We think we're doing better at having those conversations. DG can be permitted. I think, you have situations where it's sized like it was in the Bank of America building. It's very helpful. But the one thing that people don't talk about is that the New York State DEC has not issued guidelines for emissions of DG that are particularly as stringent as, for example, new power plants. And in addition, the stacks for those tend to be lower. So, there are some emissions issues when you've got fossil fuel-fired DG. Those aren't the same for renewables. Renewables, you just have to put in a separate place because it's administered as a regulatory matter elsewhere. We're happy to talk to our customers about DG. The issue of microgrids has not yet really come up, although NYU sort of has a campus microgrid here. Outside of the campus environment in New York City, there are lots of regulations that probably inhibit that. And at some point, I imagine we will get even feistier about protecting our franchise for our shareholders.
Thank you. Our next panel will start immediately after this one, and I want to please give a round of applause for our excellent speakers. Thank you so much.